Mason as he introduces Jonathan Franzen.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to have this chance to speak to you tonight with Jonathan Franzen, one of our great American novelists. And by way of introduction, I'll say a few words about his new novel, Crossroads, this way. In 1955, Congress unanimously voted to replace our de facto motto, E pluribus unum, out of many one, with In God We Trust. And then in 1956, legislated that every piece of U.S. currency minted or printed thereafter would feature prominently this theistic motto. So kindergartners of the 1960s became the first generation of American public school children to whom it would be unknown not to recite every morning a pledge overseen by a creator, children whose every nickel saved or squandered on bubblegum and creamsicles, or later prostitutes and bags of pot, would be underwritten by an implicitly Christian Lord. So by the time John Lennon sang in 1970, God is a concept by which we measure our pain, he was non-denominationally describing our metaphysical condition, but he was also dismantling a myth that sought to bind one American to another, one which, as never before, was tearing us apart. Into the rift between secularism and church-going, Jonathan Franzen has set his sixth and latest novel, Crossroads, the first of what promises to be three linked novels under the broad banner, A Key to All Mythologies. Like all his novels, Crossroads burrows into the walls behind which a group of people endure the particularly excruciating form of self-flagellation that we call family life. The Probsts, the Hollands, the Lamberts, the Berglunds, the Tylers, the fictional families from Franzen's earlier novels are now joined by the Hildebrandts, very unhappy in their own way and very conflicted in their relationships with mainline Protestant ideas of goodness. A once passionate couple, Russ and Marion, are now married to their misery, 4 children, Clem, Becky, Perry, and Judson, living in the inky shadows of their parents' unhappiness. This family is approaching crisis. And I can't think of another American writer who was so sensitively and originally imagined family than Jonathan Franzen, who is with us now. Jonathan, welcome.
Hey, Wyatt. Thanks for being here.
So, Jonathan, would you be so kind as to read from the beginning of this novel?
Oh, it's funny you should ask. I have the book right here. I'll start at the beginning, but I will not go far. The sky, broken by the bare oaks and elms of New Prospect, was full of moist promise, a pair of frontal systems grayly colluding to deliver a white Christmas, when Russ Hildebrandt made his morning rounds among the homes of bedridden and senile parishioners in his Plymouth Fury wagon. A certain person, Mrs. Frances Cottrell, a member of the church, had volunteered to help him bring toys and canned goods to the community of God that afternoon. And though he knew that only as her pastor did he have a right to rejoice in her act of free will, he couldn't have asked for a better Christmas present than 4 hours alone with her. After Russ's humiliation 3 years earlier, the church's senior minister, Dwight Hafley, had upped the associate minister's share of pastoral visitations. What exactly Dwight was doing with the time Russ saved him, besides taking more frequent vacations and working on his long-awaited volume of lyric poetry, wasn't clear to Russ. But he appreciated his coquettish reception by Mrs. O'Dwyer, an amputee confined by severe edema to a hospital bed in what had been her dining room. He appreciated the routine of service, especially to those who, unlike him, couldn't remember one thing from 3 years ago. At the nursing home in Hinsdale, where the mingling smells of holiday pine wreaths and geriatric feces reminded him of Arizona high country latrines, he handed old Jim Devereaux the new church membership Facebook they'd been using as a prompt for conversation, and asked if Jim remembered the Pattison family. To a pastor feeling reckless with Advent spirit, Jim was an ideal confidant, a wishing well in which a penny dropped would never hit bottom and resound. Pattison, Jim said. They had a daughter, Frances. Russ leaned over his parishioner's wheelchair and paged the C's. She goes by her married name now, Frances Cottrell. He never spoke her name at home, even when it would have been natural to, for fear of what his wife might hear in his voice. Jim bent closer to the picture of Frances and her two children. Oh, Franny! I remember Franny Patterson. Whatever happened to her? She's back in New Prospect. She lost her husband a year and a half ago. Terrible thing. He was a test pilot for General Dynamics. Where is she now? She's back in New Prospect. Oh, Franny Patterson. Where is she now? She came back home. She's Mrs. Frances Cottrell now. Russ pointed at her picture and said it again. Frances Cottrell. She was meeting him at the First Reform parking lot at 2:30. Like a boy who couldn't wait for Christmas, he got there at 12:45 and ate his sack lunch in the car. On his bad days, of which there'd been many in the past 3 years, he resorted to an elaborate detour into the church through its function hall, up a stairwell and down a corridor lined with stacks of banished pilgrim hymnals, across a storage room for off-kilter music stands, and a creche ensemble last displayed 11 Advents ago, a jumble of wooden sheep and one meek steer, graying with dust, with whom he felt a sad fraternity, then down a narrow staircase where only God could see and judge him, into the sanctuary via the secret door in the paneling behind the altar, and finally out through the sanctuary's side entrance to avoid passing the office of Rick Ambrose, the director of youth programming. The teenagers who massed in the hallway outside it were too young to have personally witnessed Russ's humiliation, but they surely knew the story of it. And he couldn't look at Ambrose without betraying his failure to follow their savior's example and forgive him.
Thank you for that, John. So I'm very glad that you happen to have read from the beginning of the novel up to the point you did, because there's a sentence I want us to just take a brief look at as we begin our conversation. It's the sentence that begins, that we have in our ears still, on his bad days, of which there'd been many in the past 3 years. It's 124 words, and it takes us through a detour that Russ himself takes, an elaborate detour, you write, through the church as he's attempting to evade Rick Ambrose. And to me, it seems like the kind of sentence in its form that you've been writing throughout your career. And it's the kind of sentence without which your books, it seems to me, don't succeed. And because we're having a little technical snafu, I'm going to disappear behind this piece of paper while I attempt to show you the sentence out there, just so that you have it in sight for a moment. And then I'm going to draw on it for another second before John takes one look at it too. So there's a moment in it. I'm going to read this little phrase, which is the M dash clause that comes in the middle of the sentence. You can see the two M dashes there. And it goes, into the church, through its function hall, up a stairwell and down a corridor linked with stacks of banished pilgrim hymnals, lined with stacks of banished pilgrim hymnals, across a storage room for off-kilter music stands, and a creche ensemble last displayed 11 Advents ago, a jumble of wooden sheep and one meek steer graying with dust, with whom he felt a sad fraternity, and then down a narrow staircase where only God could see and judge him, into the sanctuary via the secret door in the paneling behind the altar, and finally out through the sanctuary's side entrance. The cadences and rhythms that this sentence exhibit and the movement of it perform the act of evasion that Russ is undertaking. And we might wonder how a sentence like this is built, how it works, what makes it work, and why it's at a sonic level so persuasive. And there are little things in it that we wouldn't notice unless we're really listening. And my favorite phrase in it is, with whom he felt a sad fraternity. With whom he felt a sad fraternity. This is a 10-syllable phrase, which is actually, it turns out, in iambic pentameter. And the first thing I guess I'd ask John, in thinking about the subject of our conversation, or one of them today, which is what makes for good writing. And I wonder how aware you are in writing a sentence like that of the features of poetry that it possesses in the prose.
Well, thank you. I love what an attentive reader you are. I would like to say to everyone present that it's a real pleasure to speak with a critic who not just a critic, but a critic who I genuinely admire and indeed admire so much. I'm a little bit in awe of. I think you have a facility with articulating what's going on in a text that I can only envy. So Wyatt's going to play the wise, articulate one, and I'm going to be the kind of instinctive blurter. Obviously, I don't think about iambic pentameter when I'm writing. I think, I've been sitting for about a year trying to get this book going, and I had finally figured out that Russ had been humiliated and that it had to do with his much younger colleague, Rick Ambrose. And indeed that there was a feud between them. The men have offices next door to each other. They haven't spoken for 3 years. Once I had that in place, plus the fact that he's pursuing this young widow, Frances Cottrell, I was able to start writing. And I have to say that I write slowly nowadays. It doesn't just tumble out. It's more a matter of waiting and trying to get a sense of the shape of a page, or in this case, maybe the first 3 pages of the book. And part of what, first of all, sitting on all of this for a year before I even started writing did, and also because it's the very opening of the book, I had the sense we need to know where we are. So really my only thought was we need a sense of the geography of the church, because we're going to be spending a lot of time in the church. And the fact that, yes, he is going to elaborate lengths not to run into this man he's feuding with, engenders the sentence, but for me, its primary purpose is to give you a sense of just the spatial layout of the church up front, but not to do it in a straightforward way, because that's boring to simply describe things, to do it in terms of a dynamic, in terms of an action, in terms of a motivation-driven action on his part. And then, of course, I'm trying to picture from my own childhood church what's in that attic. And it is Advent. The whole first 2/3 of the book take place on December 23, 1971. And it occurred to me, well, there's probably, what's up in that attic? They used to put a big creche thing out in front, and they've probably gotten too liberal to do that anymore, but it's still up there and it's getting covered with dust. And then I see this old steer and it reminds me of Russ. And that's kind of where that all came from.
Okay, which is a way of saying that the writing itself is not something that you're belaboring, and in fact, it's something that you're trusting.
No, it's funny. It's like it's already imminent. It's there, and I'm just, that sentence I'm sure didn't come out like that on the first draft, but it's falling into a place. There's a kind of, I have a sense of what the pacing should be. I have a sense of what a reader can stand in terms of length of sentence. And also, maybe a little bit right at the beginning to say, hey, you know what? There are going to be some long sentences in this book, and get used to it.
I want to read something from your wonderful memoir, The Discomfort Zone, and from a chapter that you write about translation and time that you were learning German. And this is a passage that takes place when you're in Munich studying. And it describes a change in your relationship to language. Goethe's poetry particularly infected me. For the first time in my life, I was smitten with the language's mating of sound and sense. There was, for example, all through Faust, the numinous interplay of the verbs, and I don't speak German, so watch me bang this up.
Steben, Streben, Geben, Leben. Yeah, and so on.
Yeah, those great. Which you say in your footnote: strive, float, weave, live, tremble, give. 6 trochees, you tell us, of the German that seem to encapsulate the inner life of an entire culture. This idea of growing smitten with language, I mean, falling in love with it in a basic way. I think that the writers that you admire and that I admire fall in love with language, particularly the language of poetry at an early age. That's an essential feature of being able to write prose. Nabokov said that somewhat Nabokovianly, you can't write prose unless you have read romantic poetry, which to me sounds like someone saying that unless you're attentive to sound and rhythm, you can't possibly write prose that manages to hold itself together. So it seems to me that you were a reader who drew on and draws on a certain relationship to sound and rhythm in writing prose that sticks together. Do you feel that that's something that's been ingrained in you through reading?
Yeah. Yes. My first real encounter with poetry was Wallace Stevens when I was 17. Spent a lot of time reading him in a summer school class, and I didn't understand him. But I actually memorized some of those poems simply because I loved how they sounded. And then a couple of years later, I had this weird experience where I'd missed a train in Europe, and I had nothing to read. I was so bored. I was freezing it was like an Italian train platform, and I had like 4 hours, and I had nothing to amuse myself with. And I started just reciting all the poetry I knew, which included some of these Stevens poems. And it was the craziest thing because I was 4 years older, and I'd started to study literature. And suddenly, in the act of reciting it, I got what he was saying. I understood the poems. So yeah, that was that. And I was writing mostly poetry when I was in Europe at that time. And when I first started writing The 27th City, it was above all about the writing. Long, really, really heavily worked over lyrical paragraphs that weren't very good. And
can I pause you there and just ask you what Wallace Stevens poems you memorized?
Certainly all of To a High-Toned Old Christian Woman. That's the one I remember. I think I had, some of the basics. Large Red Man Reading I memorized. Kind of esoteric, but there we are. So I had to kind of unlearn a lot of that. My first year of really trying to be a writer, after I got out of school, I discovered Updike, and suddenly there was all of this alliteration in my prose, and I was just pushing it up to this kind of Updike level. And I did that for a month, and I realized, no, this is actually bad.
And as you wrote, not to throw him under the bus, but you did also say, and you realized that Updike wasn't so good either in that as a prose writer there.
I think so, yeah. He kind of went the opposite direction. He started actually with a very clean, those first 2 books of stories, they're written in a very clean, beautiful language. And then because he had this capacity to do more, he overdid it, I think, pretty much through the rest of his writing career. So for me, the big discovery was Don DeLillo, because it's just overwhelming. You pick up really any of his books and you're in the presence of something so written and so beautiful, but so much more austere, so much less precious in its language that, he's still the well I go back to be reminded of what a really beautiful sentence looks like. But I have to say that it's been a kind of slow dialing back of the lyrical throughout my writing life, because I feel you can. I want to be clean. I want to have thought in every sentence. I want to get the job done, but I don't want to slow the process of reading down by having you stop and say, "Oh, that's a beautiful sentence,"
Or, oh, that's iambic pentameter.
or that's well, that's fine. I mean, I expect you to do that. That's what you're really, really good at, and I love hearing that I happen to write a perfect 10-beat phrase there. But it's I don't know what I'm saying. I guess there's this notion of the arrestingly beautiful sentence, and it's like, I don't want to arrest you. I want to keep pushing you along.
Okay, so but you're making it seem as though lyricism might be at odds with narrative power, and I think that your humility in this regard is undercutting what has continued to be a constant lyricism that you're just refining. And the reason that I wanted to look at that sentence is because I think it's not incidental to the new book, but rather you're kind of hiding your game in your sentences a little differently, and that doesn't make them any less lyrical in their nature. And so you've written in a number of places and been interviewed 463 million times, and certain things crop up about a desire to have greater transparency in your current work and to not impede the reader, and to have that kind of unmediated experience for the reader, to make it in any way feel easy, which of course it can't be because it's something written. It takes work. But you provided me with a number of sentences over the last week that exhibit certain of your affinities. And in looking at them, they all have a fundamental rigor, but also lyricism. So I wonder if in the clumsy way that we're going to do this, if I could hold up a sentence here that John has selected by Penelope Fitzgerald from The Blue Flower. And I don't know if it's technically possible for John to read this while I hold it up. Is that possible? I'm thinking that it's probably not. So I'm going to try to read it for you guys while you look at it. But here at the Hardenberg house in Klostergasse, he could tell from the great dingy snowfalls of sheets, pillowcases, bolster cases, vests, bodices, drawers, from the upper windows into the courtyard, where grave-looking servants, both men and women, were receiving them into giant baskets that they washed only once a year. The underwear of children and young persons, as well as the larger sizes, fluttered through the blue air as though the children themselves had taken flight. And that's from Fitzgerald's last novel, The Blue Flower. Do you want to talk a little bit about this sentence, John, and what it does that you admire as a novelist?
So I'm not a big fan of historical novels, and possibly the great exception is The Blue Flower. This is a sentence on the first page. Novalis, the poet, has come to see the Hardenbergs, and Fitzgerald is trying to put us immediately in the early 19th century in rural Germany. And she's chosen to do that by having Novalis arrive on the day once a year when the family washes its stuff, washes its clothes, washes its sheets. So just sort of prima facie, the fact that we're not getting the great man introduced in the court of whoever, we're getting somebody doing their laundry. It tells you she's actually interested in making you feel what it was like to be in rural Germany in the 19th century. There is, she has this long list of what's being thrown out the window, and then there's nothing flashy about it. The servants are looking grave. They are both men and women, and they're piling all this stuff that's flying out the windows into these large baskets. I added a second sentence. You'd asked for one sentence. I added a second sentence because there's a phrase in that, blue air, which when you first glance at it, you think, oh, that's bad writing. She means the blue sky or whatever, it's a blue day. No, it's rural Germany in the early 19th century. The air is blue with smoke, and she doesn't say that. She just says fluttered through the blue air. And then you are given this incredibly vivid image of like long underwear in the shape of a child, looking like a child falling out the window. It's I don't know. It's so specific. It's so subtly comic, and it is so steeped in everyday life. It's just like that. Those are sentences doing good work. What do you think of that? Those.
I mean, it's gorgeous. I love Penelope Fitzgerald's writing, and I think that she's much underappreciated, certainly in the United States. And there is a clarity and purity to her choices, but the syntax is incredibly complex. And I think syntax is one of the things that we don't think of when we think of lyrical writing or good writing enough. We typically think of embroidery and modification. So for adjectives, lushness, there's very little. It's just sheets, pillowcases, bolster cases, vests, bodices. It's a list, but it conspires by the end to the final verb, which is flight. And so the whole section is it takes us into flight with it because of its length, and so syntax, I think, has been one of your hidden weapons in all your work. And there are two kinds of syntax that a novelist, I think, has to mind. And that's the syntax of your sentence, and that's the syntax of the form of the book itself. And the one of the things that I've been struck by in your work is how you end your books. And by that, I mean the ending on a sentence which itself is part of the syntax of the form. So there's, at the end of Freedom, for example, to make this concrete, the final sentence, and I think that most of the people who will be here are not going to find this a spoiler, and I would say they've read it. To this day, free access to the preserve is granted only to birds and to residents of Canterbridge estates, through a gate whose lock combination is known to them, beneath a small ceramic sign with a picture of the pretty young dark-skinned girl after whom the preserve is named. This is this is a gorgeous sentence to me in the shape of it, in its movement to this last word, named, and its gorgeousness is a function, I think, of the form of the novel, which brings us to it. It is not a showy sentence, but it's the sentence that the book needs in order to conclude, or you could say it a different way. The book is the book that the sentence needs in order to earn its feeling. And I wonder, as a novelist, to what degree form is something which comes out of sentences for you, or whether it comes from a different place. I have giant thunderstorms above me. I don't know if anybody just heard thunder. So
Did just hear that.
Yeah.
I have always, probably to a fault, liked sentence structure. I was the kid who was trying to create the hardest to diagram sentences when we were learning to diagram sentences in 8th and 9th grade. It fascinated me, the kind of inner structure of how a sentence is put together. And it's one reason I was good at German, and why I ended up majoring in German was that German is a very, very logical, but really syntactically fascinating language. And that it was just like second nature to me. One of the things I would say in that regard is that I've become particularly fond of commas as and I use them far more than, say, any British writer would. I'm closer to the New Yorker in my love of a comma that actually does, strictly speaking, need to be there. And I don't mind enforcing the rule and putting it in, even though you might be able to get away with not, because it keeps they really are the housekeepers of a sentence, those commas. They are just, they're making sure that at every point you know where you are. And I do think that relates to some extent with the formal syntax of a novel, that I am trying to construct something, hopefully without the seams showing, but I am trying to construct something that you may not know all the facts, you may not know what's coming, but you always know where you are. You feel that there is this kind of somebody has actually put the commas in, as it were, if that makes any sense.
Absolutely. I mean, also all punctuation are pauses of different duration, and the drama of punctuation is that some pauses take longer for you to get to the next space in the sentence where something new and unexpected happens. And it's interesting that you draw a parallel to the form of a novel, because your novels are full of longer and shorter pauses. And the Corrections is a novel built of novella, interlinked novella, and there are pauses between them which are sizable because we move from one character to another. Freedom is a novel in which the construction has smaller components to it, but there is a movement with pauses between each of those sections. And this gets me to a question really about translation and what makes for good writing in a novel. Because you have just translated a novel by Thomas Brüssig, who was not known to me by name in any way prior to you telling me that you had just translated a novel by Thomas Brüssig. So he's a contemporary German writer. And you've translated what novel?
The English title would be The Short End of the Sonnenallee, which is the name of a street in Berlin. This is actually this is a co-translation project. I should stress it was initiated by somebody who loves that book, a German professor in the Midwest, and I said, you know what, go ahead and try to translate that. If you love it so much, anyone can do it. Well, not anyone can do it. So I basically, following in her footsteps, did a translation of that book. But I do want to make sure her name gets mentioned. Her name is Jenny Watson. But yeah, it's I actually love, even though it's hard, doing the translating work because it makes explicit the kind of choices you're making writing in your native language unconsciously. The first sentence of Sonnenallee is just a bear. You cannot, if you translate it literally, it's a completely awkward mess. And the translator's task facing a sentence like that is to turn around, is to keep generating possible ways in which this could be expressed. And normally, in writing my own work, I'll try 3 or 4 ways, and then I'll get, one of them will work, and I'll get it. With that sentence, each part of it, I probably tried 20 or 30 different ways, and the result actually doesn't look much syntactically like the original sentence. That's how hard it was. But it's so fun, actually. It's this sort of, all writing is a little bit puzzle-like. You've got a vague notion in your head, and you're then basically trying to solve that puzzle in the form of well-arranged sentences in a well-arranged book, and in translating someone else's work is more of a pure puzzle in that regard.
Well, so in terms of this puzzle of a book, one of the things that that most people who love novels did is read books in translation throughout their lives. And so you have written about your love of Dostoevsky, and you don't read Russian, so you're reading him in English translation. And I grew up reading Constance Garnett translations of the Russians, and depend entirely on her ability to write, which different people either impugn or celebrate, depending on taste and bias. But what's amazing about being able to read in translation a great novel is that even if it's poorly translated or adequately translated, it's nonetheless a book that we can talk about in English. War and Peace or Brothers Karamazov, whatever the quality of the translation, the novel still somehow maintains itself into the native language of the destination.
I have a kind of mystical belief that the whole is present in the parts, in the same way that our DNA is in each of our cells, and that you can pretty seriously mangle a thing, but And you can actually make it boring, as unfortunately the very celebrated, more recent co-translators of the Russian novels, I think succeed in making books that are really, really compelling in every other translation, kind of tedious to read. But even so, the gestalt comes through, and it is a matter of a gestalt.
So that's kind of mystical, isn't it? Because here we are talking about, or at least I am, iambic pentameter in the long sentences of Jonathan Franzen. And, you know, certainly when your books are translated into Italian or French or whatever, they're not going to be maintaining such features of your prose, and yet your books still work in foreign languages. So there is something mystical or scientific, if you want to use the DNA metaphor, about the integrity of a whole novel as something more than its style, its surface style.
Well, yeah, especially if what is engendering the sentences is not a love of sound. I would think it would be harder to translate Joyce, for example. I mean, there's thought and there's idea there, but a lot of it has to do with the sound. I think what will come through, even if it does not have all of the extra bells and whistles that you get in the native language, will be the thought in each sentence, and that is actually one of the factors in my turn away from sound. It's not like I've forgotten about sound, but I'm de-emphasizing it, because the main thing is to try to make sure that there's something fresh, some kind of thought in every single sentence. And if it is, then I think that'll come through more easily.
Well, on the seemingly simpler side of sentences that you sent me, here's one by Dennis Johnson from Beverly Home, or several sentences. No more pretending for him. He was completely and openly a mess. Meanwhile, the rest of us go on trying to fool each other.
You see, that's a really easy trio of sentences to translate, I think, because, I mean, I'm not sure you can quite get the colloquial schwung of it, but this is from Jesus' Son, and Jesus' Son is probably the book that more people I know can quote verbatim more sentences from than any other book by an American in the last 50 years, because it is so incredibly condensed. He is a poet. He was life as a poet. And there's nothing fancy about that. I mean, meanwhile, the rest of us go on trying to fool each other. That's all about the thought. And he's describing a man who has lost complete control of his body. The narrator, Buckhead, I believe is what he's called, is working in a home for a long-term care facility, and there's this guy who's an absolute mess, and Buckhead is completely fascinated by this person who's a complete mess, because it's pretty clear. It's not like he's hiding anything. That doesn't. There's no more work to do. Johnson has done the work. He's told you we're all messes. It's just most of us spend most of our time trying to pretend we're not. I mean, what do you make of those sentences?
Well,
give us the expert take on those sentences, please.
You're going to have to stop calling me an expert if I'm going to give you the expert take. So my sense of them is,
you're in your office at Bard. I mean, which
all these books, I must be an expert. There's no way around it. He doesn't sound like he's writing. Is what it sounds like spoken American vernacular, and it doesn't sound like our idea of what literary writing is. And that's one of the reasons that Johnson, for people of our generation, changed the way we listen to, or changed the way literary writing can sound. A late friend of mine, Guy Davenport, when responding to some people who were trying to write contemporary poetry, he read my poem and he said, not bad, but must a poem be written in poetry? And that's always struck me as being, the chief insight. I mean, how do you, as a novelist, not write novels that sound like you're writing novels, so-called, but actually you're figuring out a way to write your novel? And, syntax, I think, which is something we keep spinning around to, and the reason I bring in translation and the question of what good writing is in your books, is because I do think that there's a consistent syntax of storytelling that you figured out. Pauses between characters, which allow us to, and this is the most important part that we haven't touched on, figure out the psychology of individual human beings who intimately well because you made them. And, I'm fascinated by, in your art, how you have figured out to find forms that free you to go deeper into people. And I guess before we take a few questions, I'd like you to cruelly, briefly touch on the way in which your relationship to the human animal has changed through time as a novelist, and what it is that you're doing when you go into another human being, one you've made up, DNA up. Easy peasy.
Well, yeah, I'm struggling to even, I don't know where to begin with that. What is the question exactly? Is it about continuity? Is it about change?
Change. It's more, you say your style has changed. You say it's become more transparent. You say that there's a different way that you've approached writing sentences that allows you to get at something more just different. And I'm wondering how that approach has affected your ability to access the psychology of people, which is something you're gifted at. It's one of the things your readers come to your books for, is how you get into people.
Yeah, I guess it again has to do with transparency. When I think about, say, my second novel, Strong Motion, I think there are strong scenes in there. Technically, a lot of things are very well done. But when I go back, usually unwillingly, and take a look at that book, I feel like I'm fighting through a mass of the author's strong opinions, strong feelings, unresolved angers, and that there's a case being made. And occasionally that lets up, and I get to something, just telling the story of a complicated person. But I feel like there's a bit of a fog of polemic, and that persisted even in the corrections, and formally took the form of satire, and really, while trying to clean it all up, trying to slow down, become more measured, put the commas in, as it were. There is, I don't think it's necessarily causative, but it is possible maybe to correlate that with really leaving myself behind, and simply taking what I've invented as a given and figuring out what that person is like. Does that make any sense? I mean, sort of.
Yes, and I'm asking an unfair question because I'm not being specific about a particular character's distinction in one novel versus the depth that you get to in another. I mean, I guess what we could say is, in the new novel, you're at the beginning of describing a whole family of characters through time. And perhaps a different way of going about it is to say, with the suite of people who you have recently come up with, is there stuff that you don't yet know about them?
Oh, yeah. There are some broad strokes that I think will remain, because I spent a lot of work and time teeing them up in Crossroads. Certain things had to happen. There had to be a disaster with the third child, Perry, and Becky had to feel that she was poorly treated, and she and her older brother Clem. We need to establish that they are an unusually tight pair of siblings. There were some things there's track that was laid, but broadly, no. I was stopped dead in my tracks shortly before the storm of book promotion hit, because even though Clem was the engendering character for the entire project, I realized I have no idea what he's doing, what he wants, or even what he's like as a person when he's 47, which is the age his father was in the first volume. I just don't know that stuff. And in fact, I have some strong possibilities that are completely mutually exclusive. So no, still figuring it out. And that's good. I mean, I don't write novels from outlines, and wouldn't want to.
Okay, so much to be learned still about these people. And
well,
that's part of the pleasure for you is that not the case? The much to be learned still for you?
It's not like they exist, and I'm learning about them. So that's the wrong formulation. It's the what, say, the sequel volume looks like. What's going on with it formally? What is the thing about it that makes it unlike anything I've written before? That question is inseparable from the invention of what it is those characters want, and it's a kind of, it's a dialectic in which neither side of the dialectic has yet been defined. So it's a kind of a nightmare process, but it's always the same process. You're trying to figure out the characters, trying to find something you can work with within the context of finding a form that feels new.
Well, since we are going to open up the chat to questions now, there is one about character that we can address here. And a viewer asks, and I don't have names, how often, if ever, do you think about the characters you've written in the past? Are they still alive for you? Do you ever visit Enid Lambert and see what she's up to? Do you dream of these people? Imagine them, yeah.
You know, I will occasionally dream of characters while I'm working on them. They're done once the book is done. And that's what's weird about having projected subsequent volumes about the Hildebrandts is, I mean, I think that's part of what I'm going through now is getting over the fact that they can't be done. I can't emphasize strongly enough that the characters, that the work of the writer is to translate something in one's head into sentences on a page, which will then be deciphered and will hopefully invoke probably not the same image, but a close enough image to what was originally in the writer's head. And the key factor there is that the things get set down on the page as sentences. So even though while working, yes, I have a very clear mental picture of a character, still, even while working, that character only exists as long as I'm writing sentences that work about that character. So in this way that I think is probably literally inarticulable, the character is in the sentences. And that means that it's almost nonsensical, unless I were to write further sentences about a character, to imagine my revisiting them.
Another viewer wants to know, what is the book this year that you've read that has meant the most to you?
This year, you know, I'm still under the shadow. It was not this year, but this is sort of unofficially, it's a 2-year year because it's all the pandemic. And here I am at the Y, and I've already given a shout out to this book for Bernard, and I believe read a passage from this book. Nevertheless, I cannot help mentioning Life and Fate by Vasily Grossman. That's the last book that I read that felt like it was changing something in me, and it's the giant Soviet novel. You can talk about Master and Margarita and a few other titles, but Life and Fate is the great Soviet novel. And of course, it's very hard on the Soviets, which is why it was not published in Russia until 1989. But there, I've said the title. And
what's great about it? As a novelist, what do you admire in it?
It is essentially a 1,000-page cry of pain, with a cast of scores, if not several hundred, and it is as disillusioned as it is humane, and it is the great document of someone trying to hold on to some workable notion of humanity while trapped between the inhumanity of the Stalinist purges and the even greater inhumanity of the Nazis and the Axis. And even though it runs to 1,000 pages and has some of the best war writing, battle writing ever written in a novel, written by somebody who was there in person as a reporter, it really has this unity to it, and the unity is this question of what can you find in humanity to be hopeful about. And that's a pertinent question, and it made it very, I started reading it in the late days of the Trump administration, in the context of the pandemic, and that seemed a question of great urgency.
One question that I have that we didn't get to is the question of religious art. You have written elsewhere about the way in which Brothers Karamazov is an act of religious art, not a book about religion. And you also compare you say Chartres as a cathedral is a work of religious art. As the new novel is working in the context of people of faith and people dealing with faith, is your affection in the past for great novels of religious art informing the way you think of what you might be able to do with this world that you're working in for these books?
I'm aware of those great works of religious art. What Dostoevsky did in Brothers Karamazov was so beyond what any of us alive could do, that I would not come anywhere near trying to get in the ring with that. The Grand Inquisitor is the Grand Inquisitor, and but the key thing there is that Dostoevsky, although he could make a very strong case against religion, and who knows what he really believed, but it was clear that religion, he was all in with religion. And the matter of faith and the matter of do you believe in heaven and do you believe in God, those are actually ultimately not that relevant to the believer because we all struggle with the metaphysical stuff. But I would say that it is actually a prerequisite of religious art, is that the person has to be deeply committed to religion. I am a much more ironic person. And I have things that might resemble a religion having to do with literature or the tragic dimension of life. But I'm not religious, so I cannot make religious art.
But you can make a character who is struggling with faith, as Russ Hildebrandt is.
Absolutely, absolutely, because I grew up in it, and because, as I said, I think people who are not religious, who don't have much experience with faith, they're very hung up on, well, how can you believe this nonsense? How can you believe the world is only 5,400 years old? How can you believe that the Red Sea actually, it's like, you know what, that stuff's not that important. And the conversation one might have with God is a kind of conversation you might have with a stuffed animal whom you have imbued with a personality, with a voice, and this is, of course, what I just said would seem to be intensely trivializing of a person's sincere relationship with God, but I think they function in somewhat the same way. It's the dynamic of this is the person I've created, who I go to talk to about important stuff, and who makes me feel not alone when I do that. Wyatt has disappeared. Oh my God, Wyatt has disappeared. What do I do?
I'm here. I don't know what happened.
He's there. I don't know. Where'd you go?
Apparently, I went to begin to say goodbye because
we're
reaching.
Tom has really flown. I feel like we barely scratched the surface of what you could have said.
Hey, John, thank you for taking the time to have a conversation on the virtual Y stage with many happy people having the chance to listen to you talk. And I'm only eager for more of the book. And the last question that I won't ask is, when is the next installment coming? Because it's none of my business. We'll just wait patiently for it to happen. And I can be patient, but I don't want to be too patient. So get busy over there, for goodness sake.
Thank you. It is a disappointment not to be able to do the event at the Y in person with you. It's such a great space, and it's such a great institution. This long-running series of evenings, and it's wonderful. And I wish I were in New York. Thank you.
We wish we were too. We wish we were all in New York with all of you, and we thank you for coming to this event with Jonathan Franzen. And we all wish you well, and hope you'll return to the Y. Thanks so much, and have a great night.
Thank you, everyone.